Okay, I think we're ready to go. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for attending. Today we'll be having a conversation about redefining scholarship and research beyond academia. I'm Jane, and I'm a PhD student in the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering department, and I'm really excited to be moderating this session today. And before we get started, I just wanted to outline how the questions will be facilitated. In the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will try my best to monitor them and incorporate them in our discussion. And for our panelists, feel free to check out the chat as well and type in your answers if you see questions you're really interested in answering and we may not have time to get through to everyone. And in the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll open the floor up to questions that anyone, including the panelists, may have. And we also love to be interactive during these panels. So please feel free to throw up some emojis or put in some comments about things that really resonate with you. So to start off, again, I'm super privileged to be joined by three speakers with an impressive and diverse range of experiences beyond academia. I'm going to start with introducing Dr. Sarah Buchmeyer. Am I pronouncing that right? She received her PhD in English at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and is now the head of research and interpretive programs at the Pullman National Monument. Her research interests include 19th century American literature and developing educational programs to transform the monument into a cultural resource. And improving education is also one of Dr. Christopher Doss's specialties. He got his doctoral training in the economics of education from Stanford, and he currently serves as a policy researcher at a nonprofit called the RAND Corporation, where he incorporates technology with STEM education to improve teacher performance and student learning. And lastly, Dr. Anna Linden Weller also works in the political sphere as a policy advisor for the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. She received her master's at Oxford and subsequently her PhD at Rutgers University, where she specialized in the history of the Byzantine Empire and medieval Armenia. Dr. Weller is also a very successful novelist, operating under a pen name, Arkady Martine. Did I pronounce that right? Okay, awesome. Wasn't that amazing? These are the people who are going to talk with us today. So I think everyone here would like to acknowledge such a diverse spectrum of passions and career trajectories from each of our panelists. So I'd like to ask each of our speakers to just tell us a little bit more about yourselves and let us know about your education, your training, and ultimately how you got here. We can start off with Sarah, and then we'll cycle through to Chris and then Anna Linden.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm trained at the University of Illinois at Chicago in English and literary studies, and one of the things, especially that I think the English departments are really good at, is being sort of flexible in terms of discipline, right? So English is sort of inherently interdisciplinary. And so when you're doing literary studies, you're not just thinking about literary form, you're thinking about the social, political, economic milieu of the literature. And so my background is in 19th century American literature. I was particularly interested in sort of American religious history, and that's what I wrote my dissertation on. But I also came from a department that was really focused on labor history and labor studies, and my dissertation advisor, Walter Bud Michaels, was very much committed to those ideas. So that was also in my, at least in this sort of academic environment that I was in. And I happened to be living at that, as I was doing my PhD program, happened to be living in this neighborhood on the far south side of Chicago called Pullman, which was a historic neighborhood, had not yet been designated. It wasn't designated until 2015 as a national monument. And it was kind of a little bit of a fluke that I ended up working for the National Park Service. I was still a graduate student, suddenly without a summer class to teach, and noticed that they were hiring for seasonal rangers at the monument, which was just down the street from me. And the the job description was very close to what I did as a graduate student. I would be teaching, and I was able to do research for the park as well. And so I sort of got that job as a seasonal ranger because the park was so new and because the staff was so small. I had a lot of latitude to pursue my own interests. And then it was just this past year that I was able to secure a permanent position where I have a sort of more substantial role in running the education programs and developing interpretive programs and doing interpretive training. So I think that covers your question. Was there anything I missed in there?
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much. A lot of interesting background and how you started off as a ranger. I think that's really cool. We can move on now to Chris.
Yeah, sure. So in college, I was actually a chemistry major. So did not nowhere near what I do now. But after college, I was interested in teaching high school, and if you don't have licensure to teach in public schools, you have to teach in private schools. So I started teaching in private school for a couple of years, and I really liked it. And my principal encouraged me to go get more training, get a master's in education, and actually get licensure to teach in public schools, where there was a greater need for teachers than in private schools. So I did that. And during my teaching master's, I took a couple of electives on education policy, and got really interested in understanding the history of the American education system, the inequalities that are inherent in the education system, and efforts to try to improve and make it the system more equitable for everybody. I also learned that there was this branch of economics that basically uses statistics to try to causally figure out the effects of different interventions and policies on student outcomes, teacher outcomes, or really any outcome that you want. And so I got really intrigued by it because that was a really good combination of policy, but also kind of the scientific math background that I had. But after my master's, I went and taught for 4 more years, and then was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And the options were either stay in the classroom, either go into administration or some sort of leadership in schools, or go for my PhD. And I couldn't quite get rid of that interest, or that itch wanted to be scratched about actually learning more about it. So I went and got my PhD in the econ of education, learned a whole bunch of stuff, and then decided that academia is not what I wanted out of life. I was looking for something. Part of the reason I wasn't interested in academia is that my dissertation ended up being an early childhood dissertation, so looking at early childhood particularly, but I wasn't just interested in early childhood. I was interested in a lot of things, and I knew that if you were to go into academia, you would have to kind of become an expert in one area of education, at least until you get tenure. And that didn't quite really jive with kind of my personality. And also, while I like publishing journal articles, it wasn't kind of for me the be all end all of what we do. And so looked for opportunities outside of it, and learned about research firms like RAND, that is kind of what I like to say kind of quasi academic, in that you can kind of pursue your own funding to do your own projects, but the focus is actually implementing or affecting policy. And so it's not just about publishing a journal article, but about putting out products that people will care for and that will actually inform policymakers. So that appealed to me, and so decided to join RAND outside of grad school, and that was 5 years ago, and been here since.
Amazing. You touched on some really key points that we will be talking about later on, in particular trying to find applications of your work beyond academia and finding what really fulfills you. But before we get to that, I'd like to have Anna Linden go ahead and introduce herself.
Sure. So I have a pretty circuitous route to ending up where I am. So what I do now is I do climate and energy policy for the cabinet secretary of a New Mexico state agency. So if you think about the federal agencies. We're kind of like the state version of the Department of the Interior, my agency. So if I was much more accomplished than I am, it would be like being the policy advisor to Secretary Holland. So I write a lot of policy papers and do legislative analysis and all the things that I learned how to do as a historian. I use day to day in my job as a policy advisor. But I do have this very strange route to how I got here. It's funny that you say, Christopher, that you were a chemistry major. I was a physics major in college, and ended up with a physics and religion double, because I had gotten very interested in like different ways of explaining the world, the way you get to think about when you're an undergrad. And in the course of that, I had fallen absolutely head over heels in love with medieval Byzantium, which does not seem at all related to climate and energy policy. And mostly it's not. So that's what I got my PhD in. And I got a master's from Oxford in classical Armenian language and literature, which was part of doing that bigger PhD project. I sort of took away a year in the middle. And I worked in academia for a little while. I had some visiting assistant professorship positions. I had a pretty awesome postdoc with Uppsala University in Sweden. And while I was working there and working sort of in this pan-European context with a lot of scholars from a lot of different areas, I had gotten into a weird area of my own work where I'm trained as a historian. I'm doing a kind of literary analysis work to talk about how people think about politics. And at the same time, politics in my home country in the US had gotten extremely complicated and weird. This was 2016. And I wanted to get more involved in things that were clearly understandable to the larger population, as opposed to things that I knew were relevant, but were kind of hard to explain why. Like, okay, so medieval border politics in 1100 and how people construct their identities when they live at the like multiple cultural contexts, super relevant to what I do now. Very hard to explain if you need to talk about it in Armenian first, especially the version of Armenian that most people don't speak anymore. So I came back to the US and I actually retrained. I did another master's in urban planning, and knew from the beginning that I wanted to work in the sort of climate and energy nexus, because that had always been a passion of mine going back to being a physics major in college. I've always been really interested in electricity and electricity systems. And from there, I just fell into doing more energy economics and more energy policy work, and had the opportunity to come out here to New Mexico about 3 years ago, in the Lujan Grisham administration when that got started. And here I am. And I should mention the books also. I've been writing science fiction since like forever. I've done this always. It used to be a hobby. Then I apparently got good at it. So now it's another career. So that it's less of a straight path. It's more a thing that I've always done. I've always thought of myself as a like dual career person. I'm a writer and I do academia, or I'm a writer and I do policy work.
I love it. I love hearing all of these changes and journeys and everything. This is great. And what I want to start off talking about is comparing and contrasting your research environments between grad school and where you are now. Anna Linden, you mentioned that a lot of your PhD work in history and everything translates to your policy work now. How?
In the sense that I think one of the things that doing history work at the graduate level really does train you to do is to synthesize an enormous amount of information that isn't immediately clear about how they are relevant to each other, and create an understanding of a time period of a particular political movement or social movement or an event. Why did a war happen in a particular place at a particular time? You have to read a lot and synthesize a lot. And essentially that's what I'm doing when I read 18 different versions of a piece of legislation from 18 different political groups who all want to do something about a topic, and try to understand these big sort of gestalt ideas and distill them down into something that is actionable for policymakers. So it's that kind of being able to build a big picture from a lot of small pictures work.
That's a really great point. It gives me hope in all the reading I've been doing, but no, that's really interesting to hear. And Chris, I actually also want to see how your fundamental knowledge in chemistry translates to your work now. And does it help you in establishing or conducting research into STEM education?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think so, majoring kind of in a hard science is kind of a mindset, right? So trying to using kind of like the scientific method to try to view the world, try to understand the world, and try to answer questions in the world. And that was directly applicable to kind of what I'm doing now. Except it's a lot harder in social science. So, if you want to vary one variable in chemistry, it's pretty easy to do it, or in hard science, it's pretty easy to do it because you have a lot of control over the physical world, and you know how the physical world will act. Try to vary one variable with people. It's a little bit difficult because you don't know how people are going to react. So it's like the work I do now is an interesting extension. I think a lot more of a complicated extension of what you try to do in the hard sciences. And in the face of that, what you have to do is like just a lot of statistics to try to account for a lot of things that humans do. So in that sense, kind of like the scientific training I had is very kind of applicable to kind of the training and the way I see the world now, and informed why I think I went into this type of way of looking at education. Kind of topically, I think it informs it in that part of what I do is kind of STEM education. That's one of kind of topically. So I continue to be interested not only in science, but then how do you teach science to kids in the best way possible, and how do you train teachers to teach science in the best way possible, particularly when the pool of potential science teachers is small. And so a lot of kids are not exposed to people who are actually trained in the topics that they're teaching. So that kind of informs one of my topics. And I actually think that being a teacher, kind of writ large, also informs a lot of what I did, not necessarily a science teacher, but like a teacher in general, because, when you're conceptualizing a study, there's a lot of things that go on in schools, and I worked in schools like as a teacher in some way or shape for about 7 years. So you kind of understand the kind of complexities of what it is. And then you also kind of know when you're designing a study, what you're going to ask of teachers, whether that's actually like reasonable to do given everything else that they have to do. And so just the contextual knowledge I gained from being a teacher and how schools work, I think really helps me when I think about what are the studies I want to do and how I want to design them.
And how would you compare your work now as to what you were doing as a grad student? Like how are your abilities so different?
So it's really similar to what I was doing in grad student, and it would be pretty similar to what I would be doing as a professor. So I directly use all kind of my training is directly applicable in terms of conceptualizing a study, leading it, and then kind of doing the analysis. The only difference I think is the types of studies I do, I think, are broader because let's say a client wants to understand something, I can get them the best answer given the tools that we have and the data that we have. It might not always be publishable in a journal, because it might not be like the best type of study you can do. You do the best that you can. And like, so if you try to publish it in a journal, the referees will legitimately say, you have an account for X, Y, and Z. Having kind of that broader taste of RAND is like, it allows me to kind of inform as many people as possible in the best way as possible. And you kind of caveat the results knowing what your weaknesses are, but it doesn't necessarily stop you from doing things. And in fact, you help people make decisions off the best information you can get, even if that information is imperfect. So I would say like the difference between what I'm doing in grad school and what I'm doing now is that the types of projects I'm doing are a lot broad. Some definitely will end up in academic journals. Others will be more, geared to the needs of a specific client, even though it's not perhaps quote unquote academic enough.
Okay, that's interesting. And it's interesting you bring up academic enough, because I actually want to talk about transitioning out of the university setting. And Sarah, I ran across this article that you wrote called Does Leaving the University Mean Leaving Academia? And I love how you state that we don't suddenly stop being scholars because we need to pay bills. And you also call out a fundamentally false dichotomy between the value of scholarship in universities versus any other research entity out there. And so this question is open to all panelists, but I'd like to get Sarah's perspective on what being an academic is like outside of a university setting.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. I think one of the things that really frustrated me as a graduate student when I was thinking about my, career options, and do I try and go for the tenure track professorship, or do I try and find other career paths that are sort of supposed to be alt-ac or outside academia. And I think sort of getting this job with the National Park Service and realizing, as my fellow panelists have also described, that so much of the work that I did as a park ranger was almost indistinguishable from the work that I was doing as a graduate student and as a college instructor. And it, I think the main thing was that there's somewhere like other people, the sort of academic world saw you as doing something different. And that was, I think, one of the things that I found really frustrating. But I've lost track of your original question.
No worries. The original question was just what's your take on being an academic outside of the university setting?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I sort of that I really like about being an academic outside of the university setting is the partnerships that I am able to make with other cultural institutions. So we have local partnerships here in Pullman who are passionate people who want to help tell the story of Pullman. And connect people to that story. And I think there are ways in which, we're also able to leverage the universities that are in the Chicago area and reach a much wider audience. When you're an academic, you do have a fairly limited audience. When you're working with the federal institution, your goal is to reach as many people as possible. And I think one of the things that is really sort of fun and sometimes challenging is being able to modulate what you do for all kinds of people, because we like to think that like the public is sort of the less informed version of people that we talk to, but we get people who are scholars themselves, right, who are part of our public, and then who are people who are just sort of sort of show up and want to learn, and you have to be able to speak to all of that. And so, yeah, I think that is one of the sort of joys of being an academic outside of academia. I think one of the challenges it comes with some of the resources, and this was one thing that I was the article that you mentioned. One of the things that I was sort of calling for was better access to academic resources for people who are working outside of academia. Because when you sort of remove yourself from that, from the institution of the university, you also lose access to databases and things like that you sort of get automatic. And I think that's one of the challenges is trying to figure out how to navigate or find resources in other ways.
That's a really good point. And I think that's a thing that a lot of academics take for granted. Because I forget the amount of resources I have access to now. And when I leave, I don't know what I'm going to do. But I want to revisit, you mentioned something very interesting, that your work as a park ranger is very similar to that of being a grad student. And how? Because for me, I envision a park ranger just going out into nature, but as a grad student, we're sitting in the office 24/7. So yeah, let us know.
Yeah, so I will say a little bit about the park that I work at is an urban historical park. So I sort of consider myself an inside ranger. I disappoint people all the time with how little nature knowledge I have. I can't identify trees to save my life, but I do talk about the labor history. And there's a sort of this was a company town built in 1880, and it's sort of famous for this big strike in 1894 that led to the establishment of Labor Day. And then the story of the Pullman Porters, which is considered the first successful African-American labor union. So we tell these stories. And a lot of the things that I do is, we develop programs. A lot of the things that we do are things like walking tours. So for instance, we have a big celebration every Labor Day. For Labor Day, we developed a special tour, and that tour was about the sort of overall theme of the relationship between diversity and solidarity. And so I helped write that tour and develop that tour. And a lot of the things that I did were the things that I had done to write my dissertation. I went into the archives. I did research on the labor strikes that had happened, before 1894 and the conditions of that. I basically wrote what many grad students would sort of recognize as something like a conference paper or job talk or something like that. And but it's performed outside, basically. And then I developed some interactive materials to help the folks engage with the story a little bit more. That really comes from the teaching experience of a graduate student, because I did a lot of teaching at UIC. And so there's that combination of, finding some unanswered question or theme, developing a talk or a program based on research, and then presenting it to the public. And there's a lot of that. So I actually do spend a lot of time inside and on a computer, sort of developing these programs.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It still sounds
Yeah.
wonderful. I love your work. I love how applicable all this work is to society, because sometimes PhD students are researchers so niche, and so you kind of lose the big picture image. And so what I want to move on to is to seek your advice on how to approach these different career trajectories when you're not necessarily exposed to it actively during your degree, because now a lot of PhD students are just kind of pigeonholed and laser focused into just getting the degree, and they're not aware of opportunities out there. So I'm wondering, what steps did you guys take to kind of take yourself out of the university realm?
I am not a good example. I would have stayed probably. Part of why I decided to leave, and I left after working in academia post, sorry about that, post getting my degree, was that there simply were not research-oriented tenure track jobs in my area that were, I mean, it was something like, I think my last year of the job market, I applied to 60 jobs, had 5 interviews, there were about 400 applicants for each job. And that's all medieval history. And my specialty was quite narrow. But even before that, I had been realizing that the kind of work I was doing was more interdisciplinary by my own inclination than maybe those search committees were really wrapping their heads around, or what they were looking for was something that was not necessarily, well, yes, you're a historian, but what you're doing is a kind of narratology, literary analysis to talk about a political theory. Like those things don't, that's 3 different departments. That's an English department or a literature department, a history department, and a poli-sci or international relations department. And I had that one good postdoc, which was kind of squished all that together, but those are rare. So I think if I could tell PhD students what to do, is to not assume that your ability to be a scholar and to contribute intellectually to the knowledge of the world ends if you don't get that brass ring tenure track job. It does not. It does not at all. Yes, I publish less than I did when I was working full-time in academia. That's just a nature of what your day-to-day looks like when you are working outside. You don't have that endless research time, or not endless like publish or perish, but intense research time. On the other hand, the things I write now show up in policy documents that are adopted by a US state, in talking points that are sometimes used by the governor of that state. And I also have published in my original field, in medieval history, since I left academia. And some of that was things that I had been working on, and some of it was littler things that I just was really interested in. I think it's more difficult, and this goes to your point, Sarah, about people in academia sometimes not understanding that we do this work wherever we are, that it's the nature of, and that a PhD is it should be like a union card, that like, okay, now you're part of the society of scholars and your contributions are valuable and you proved that. And I would love to see more acknowledgement from academia that non-academic scholars who do have their qualifications but do other work are as publishable as those of us who work in the academy. But on the other hand, I also think that it's very freeing to not be, like you said, Christopher, stuck in a specialty. It's kind of great. The opportunity to have a lot of different focuses, to have a little bit more breadth in your work is really invigorating. I am never bored at my job.
I would add that for me, kind of understanding the types of jobs that would be available to me outside of academia, your kind of alumni networks are really key. So there was a person who just happened to start working at RAND a couple of years before I did. We shared an office. So when I was thinking about research firm positions, I had no idea what they were about. And so I called him up and I said, hey, can you talk about what your experiences are? What do you do day to day? And there are some other alumni who went to competitors, and so I called them up and tried to understand kind of like what that space looked like. But then, a classmate of mine worked for Airbnb afterwards as a data scientist. And he got that because one of the alums from like maybe 5+ years ago decided she wanted to do work at Airbnb. And so by the time, we were ready to graduate, she was pretty high up in the company, but she was an alumni. And so he pulled her up and they got to talking, and now he's at Airbnb. And so, and if I look at where my classmates are now, there's people in academia, there's people in tech, there's people back in school districts, there's people working for state departments, right? People naturally kind of find themselves in different places. And so it's a resource for you to kind of reach out and say, hey, can I talk to you about what your experiences are? What do you do? How is what you learned here applicable to what you do now? And I find that actually like undergrads are a lot better at that than kind of grad students. So, I'll, through my undergrad, I guess I at some point signed up for some database where like people could reach out to me, and I'll have them, I'll get a couple of requests, a year from them. And then through LinkedIn, there'll be people where we shared a school, and they'll come out, they'll like email me on LinkedIn, and they're usually kind of like undergrads, maybe master's level. But I've talked to people in the PhD program that I did who are PhD program students now, mostly because the professors are like, hey, Chris is at Rand, if you're interested, like go talk to him. But I've never had like PhD students from other cohorts or like, come talk to me or ask me where I am now. And that could be just because they're, they found their own way, and that's great. But I think, don't be afraid to kind of reach out to people in your networks or people who you share a school with and ask them for it. The worst they can do is not respond, which is fine. But even if you get them on the phone for a half hour, that's, information that you can use.
Yeah, I think, and I sometimes it's hard. I remember, hearing about how to find different opportunities, and like networks is always the thing that sort of comes up. A lot of the advice that I got was also about volunteering, which can be a very difficult thing to take on as a graduate student if you're doing stuff for free. In my position, it was nice because I was able to try something out and get paid. I had this sort of temporary employment. One of the things, especially thinking about, thinking about how married you are to the narrow focus of the work that you're doing, right? Of course, your project as a graduate student is going to have a narrow focus. Even if you went into an academic job, your work will expand naturally as you take on new projects and things like that. So start thinking expansively about the work that you do. Those broad categories that you list as your research interests, right? Think about how you might describe those to people outside of academia, and where those interests exist in other types of institutions. And I will say one of the things that I will throw in the chat is a link to the USA Jobs website. What's really nice about that website is you can search, you can do a sort of general search for kinds of work. So they have all kinds of work sort of categorized. If you're interested in, for example, doing writing and editing, there is a series, and they will show you all of the jobs that are related to writing and editing. Or if you say, okay, I want to work for a particular institution, you can look and see what jobs are available at a particular institution, what kinds of people are they looking for, and just start getting the habit of kind of looking through those and reading those job descriptions and seeing how you might start to fit yourself into those job descriptions. and think about, you know, how you might take on maybe little side projects with the institutions that are, you know, within your reach, even if it's, you know, helping, you know, if you're interested in the museum route, for example, reach out to a museum, and, you know, if it's related to your research, you know, see if they would have an opportunity for you to sort of like help with a special program or a special exhibit or something like that. Especially smaller museums are usually really interested in making those partnerships, and are not going to necessarily reach out to you to initiate that.
I just have one more thing to add to that, because it made me think of something that I didn't know about when I was in academia, but have discovered while doing this job and policy work, is we in government commission studies from universities all the time. And a lot of the time that work ends up being assigned to graduate students. One of the things my agency does is we monitor and remediate old mines, and there's a lot of old uranium mines in New Mexico. And about 2 years ago, we had the University of New Mexico do a economic study on what it would take to stand up a workforce that could actually do uranium mine remediation at the degree that would mean that we could really handle this problem in a couple of years, maybe a decade. And that question went to an economics department, but that economics department went to a geology department, went to an environmental science department. There was a whole bunch of people. I don't know who all of them were, but if you are still in grad school, your department is probably involved in one or more of this kind of thing for some outside of academia institution. And if you're interested in knowing what the kinds of things we would want to know, and that you could do, and that study is something that we contracted out because no one in our mining division has that kind of background. But if that was an energy study, it might have been something that I did, or that I did in partnership with our economic development department. So there's a lot out there that is going on even in the university that might get you a window into other kinds of research.
And I will say one more thing. I noticed that there are universities that are starting to put money into supporting graduate students exploring other career options. And so I know my alma mater, UIC, has a graduate internship fund. And so it's like $5,000 for a summer internship, where you can kind of find an institution that you're interested in and propose the project that is a sort of public-facing project, and sort of explore other careers. And that's another way to make some connections, even in the exploration process of doing that.
That's great. I didn't know these resources existed and everything. So thank you so much for sharing that. We are nearing the end of our time, and I believe I incorporated all the questions that have been DM'd to me. And so to just round us off, I would just like for our panelists to share some words of wisdom. So looking back on your PhD, when you decided to go beyond academia, what made you want to take that lunge, and what challenges did you face? And do you have any advice for any of us that are trying to get out of the university?
Well, I can start. I will say, someone who went into the PhD program already being warned that the job market is bad, right? I still had a kind of a sense of wanting to do exactly the things that that I would do as an academic. I wanted to teach. I wanted to do my own research and pursue sort of these sort of questions about literary form, but also the 19th century American culture and things like that. I think when I was able to recognize that I could still do those things and not have to sort of struggle through maybe years of piecing together an income with adjunct work, it was relatively easy to make that switch. I think one of the things, one of the sort of pieces of advice or words of wisdom to give is really that you don't have to shed your identity as an academic, and I think that's very much on display in the conversation here. That when you consider yourself working at a different place other than a university, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are no longer a scholar or no longer an academic. So it doesn't have to be a kind of existential crisis about where you work. You can do a lot of the same things and do things in maybe sometimes a more fulfilling way in other institutions.
You won't probably be the only one there. One of the weirdest and most lovely surprises about the job I have now is that my direct supervisor, the deputy secretary, is also a former historian who worked in a tenure track job for several years before deciding that what he wanted to do was much more direct, and he became a lawyer and then a conservation policy expert. So there's also it can be difficult to imagine having a community where you get to talk so intensely and deeply about the subjects and methods of analysis that you find in the university. And it is sometimes hard to find that outside, but it's not impossible. And you might be surprised about how many people want to have those really deep, really involved, in some cases, very technical conversations at your outside of academia job.
And just really quickly, I would just say, just be honest with yourself, right? Like, people's interests change. You learn from your PhD program. And so having your kind of interests evolve from the beginning to the end is really natural. And, there's a lot of people have pressure to go into academia. Like, for a lot of professors, you're only successful if you become a professor. But I think that's becoming a lot less over time, particularly as people realize that there's a lot of options out there. So just be honest with yourself, find people who will support you and help you learn and grow from it. And then you'll be happier kind of following your desires rather than trying to fit into some sort of expectation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. As a fifth-year PhD student, halfway through our year, this has been very, very, very helpful. And I'm pretty sure everyone in the audience has found your testimonies very inspiring, along with all your resources. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming here. And I especially like to thank our panelists for sharing their stories with us. And that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Other than that, everyone's free to leave. Thank you.